In a seemingly peaceful small town, the protagonist encounters a mysterious figure that repeatedly appears at night, seemingly guiding him towards the unknown. But who is this figure? Why does it keep appearing on his journey? Can he unravel this mystery? Explore the unknown, subscribe without pause. Don't miss an episode, click subscribe to join our adventure. We quickly forgot about it because Johnny's family had just gotten a Nintendo 64, and we started playing Mario. I cannot remember if it was the next day or week or what, but sometime after this happened, we were both with his mom getting donuts, and we saw a wanted poster with a sketch of a man that looked awfully similar to the guy who chased us. He was apparently wanted for trying to kidnap a boy outside of a school. Johnny and I looked at each other and seemingly telepathically agreed to never say a word. I don't know why we never spoke up. Maybe it's because we were at an age where we'd be relentlessly bullied by homophobes because of the mere possibility that we could have been well assaulted like that, but we never did speak of it again. As I'm sharing this, I'm considering reaching out to him to see if he remembers, and if it aligns with my memory of the incident. There were so many different things that happened in my childhood in the 90s that could have easily ended with me dead. Somehow I'm still here, and I even have my own family now. I trust no one because of incidents like this, and these days I always have my head on a swivel. A few years ago, my mother died after a long battle with cancer. In her last few weeks, she was bedridden at home at one point and on heavy pain medication. The whole family took turns to help and spend time with her, and what she told us towards the end gave us all a shock. She kept having a scared reaction to something. She'd jump up and say, "Oh my goodness," or she'd swear, as if something had made her jump. She didn't say anything at first, but then, after a week or two, blurted out something one day that gave us all the creeps. I wish he'd stop scaring me, tell him to go away. She was annoyed at something, or someone to be exact, confused. We asked her what the problem was and she told us. Apparently in her last few weeks, she kept seeing her deceased partner walking around the house. He'd walk down the hallway or past her bedroom door, or sometimes he'd be sitting in a room, and every time that it would happen, she would jump with fright, obviously not expecting to see him there. She was more annoyed than scared, I guess, but she'd see him several times a day just going about his business, as if he'd never left. Usually her reaction would be, "Oh, for goodness sake, go away," not because she didn't want to see him, but because it kept making her jump. Our first thought was that it was something to do with the pain medication that she was receiving, but the nurse assured us that it wouldn't cause hallucinations or visions or anything. It absolutely terrified us to know that as well. She went into hospice a few weeks later, and it was then too that the vision stopped. Weird her, we still don't even talk about it either, because that's how creeped out we all are by it. I've debated sharing this for well a long time, but never got around to it, mainly because I try to keep this memory out of my brain. This might be a long one, but it's a creepy thing. That happened to me about 4 years ago. So, for starters, I grew up in southwest Saskatchewan and moved on to my aunt's farm in 2019 to live in the other house that is on their property. The house is fairly old, but to be honest I loved it. Wasn't long, though after I moved in that I started to feel, I guess, uneasy in the house alone. I would close every window when it got dark, as it felt like something was watching me through them every night. Eventually I decided to get a puppy to keep myself company when my boyfriend at the time was at work or away from the house. It helped to have the company, but I always dreaded having to take her outside when it was dark for a bit of scene setting. Our house sat on the left side of the gravel road. At the back of the house there was about 10 m of backyard, and then there was the cow pasture and the cow barn. We didn't own cows, but in the summer another farmer would rent out our pasture space, and so we would have them on the property. It wasn't uncommon at night to hear coyotes surround the farm either, and there were tons of them as well. Every so often when I'd go out with my puppy, we'd hear them all around us, too close for comfort as well. We had a farm dog too, who would keep the coyotes away for the most part, as she was huge, but every so often she would wander elsewhere on the property to scout and the coyotes would get a little too close. They always tried to lure my puppy out to them as well, but luckily I kept her leashed. Now, one thing you should know about my pup is that it takes her forever to find a spot to go potty. This is still a problem today, 4 years later even, but back then it was the bane of my existence. She would pace for at least 5 minutes, and that was only after finding a suitable spot. Sometimes we would be out there for like near half an hour, just so she would go and not going in the house. Another problem of hers huskies. I right anyway. On this particular night it was raining pretty heavily. I was not happy to be out there, and she had decided that she wasn't going to go until she found her perfect spot. We had already been out there for 15 minutes, and at this point she was also getting frustrated with the rain and wanted to go inside, but I wanted her to go before we went in, since we'd already been out there for so long. So, as any annoyed puppy mother would do, I started getting a little bit frustrated and would repeat "go potty" every time that she get distracted from her objective. It was dark. I was cold and annoyed, and to make matters worse, the cows behind us were fussing fairly loudly too. This was out of the ordinary for them. They were usually quiet and sleeping at this time of night. I was also hearing what sounded like a strange bird whistling, but shook it off as probably being an owl up in a tree somewhere. I tried to keep it out of my mind as I kept shouting and pleading "go." I was facing away from the pasture and suddenly, though in my left ear, I heard it go. Now one thing you should know about me is that I have a very strong flight response. Typically, but this froze me on the spot, as I was mostly confused at what the heck I just heard. I tried telling myself I didn't hear it. I tried telling myself that it was just a move from a cow that I had heard wrong, but again, as if spoken directly behind me, I heard it again "go, go." It sounded unnatural. It was as if it came from someone who had never spoken a word before, a raspy, deep monotone "go." It almost sounded like it was coming out of an old radio, but of course there were no radios out there. Every time that it said it sounded the exact same as the first time it was said, and whatever it was, had started repeating it, as if it had been taught its new favorite word. At this point I spun around to the pasture to find nothing there, but then again from behind me, in the opposite direction, "now go." This had all happened in the span of about 3 seconds, and at this point I remember shouting out loud, "All right, you don't have to tell me twice." As I picked up my little furball and made a dash for my front door, I swiftly locked both doors behind me and sat bewildered in my kitchen. Puppy went back to pewing immediately, obviously unbothered by it all, and happy Mom wasn't making her stay out in the rain any longer. I picked up my phone and called my aunt asking her if my uncle had been out in the field with the cows. She said no, and I explained to her what had just happened to me. She sent my uncle over to the pasture to check it out, but soon after told me that he hadn't seen or heard anything. He said that he checked the pasture again in the morning, but again there was nothing. I spent my night hiding from the windows, with the lights and the TV on loud enough to not hear anything outside. The next morning, when my uncle checked on the pasture, he didn't see anything out there, but what he did find was 2 CVEs that were dead. That explains the colossal cow panic that had ensued the night before. I regret this, but I didn't push for any more information, as I honestly just didn't want to know, but they told me other than that they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. A few months after that, and I started going to therapy for the paranoia that this had caused me, I started feeling like people were watching me out to get me. Another few months after that, I moved out of the province for good and finally felt safe. I'm wondering, though, if any of you here have any idea of what the heck this could have been. There's no chance that there would have been someone out in our field, as we were fairly far away from town and neighbors, and we have cameras that would have seen anyone enter our property. Coyotes are common, like I said, but I don't think they have a capability of mimicking words, so do you have any ideas? Since moving, I've had some weird related things happen as well, but I'll save that for another time if you guys want to hear it. Thank you to anyone who can contribute to this, and thanks for hearing me out. To give some context, I used to be a 911 dispatcher for a small city. We dispatched all law, fire, EMS for the entire county, and within this county were multiple law agencies. I had been there for about 3 months or so when I met him. His name was Jake, had recently transferred from a big department in California and landed himself randomly at our department. It didn't make much sense as to why he left California in the first place, but he always insisted that it was just time for him to move out to a smaller, less dangerous department. Him and I quickly became close and would chat almost every day after I got off shift. Within a few months, it became apparent that we liked each other, and our flirting progressed into something more serious. Fast forward a few months later, and it turns out that he was doing some inappropriate things to photos or videos of me whilst he was actively on duty. This and a few other things that he had kept hidden on duty led to him losing his license and leaving during the process of his termination. His sergeant had suggested that I get a protective order against him, as he had apparently made threatening statements previously towards me, such as "you better be telling the truth. I'll find out on Tuesday if you're lying to me," etc. I had began to fill out the paperwork, and was told that I had a temporary protective order on him in the meantime. But don't think that I ever actually did anyway. About 2 weeks later, after his termination, he calls me to catch up. The entire call is like an old friend to an old friend. What am I doing for work? Do I have a boyfriend now? But progressively turns more personal. When does my shift end? What do I drive? Being 18 and naive, I treated him like I always had, answering his questions. I had contacted his old department afterwards, as his sergeant had told me to let him know if I was ever contacted again, but they turned me away pretty quickly and didn't want anything to do with it. So with that I blocked Jake. Roughly a month later I get a call from a new number, and it's Jake. Once again, he wants to meet up and catch up, but this time he so casually goes on to tell me about this new house that he's wanting to buy in my neighborhood. Knowing that it's my neighborhood, I had never told him where I lived in town, let alone what specific neighborhood I lived in. During this call, he progressively got more aggressive as well, making statements such as if I knew that I was going to get canned. I should have just had my way with you. He half-heartedly joked about getting a hotel room just for me, and well, that was that. A few days later he FaceTimed me, and once again came off as simply wanting to catch up as he was sick. Midway through our seemingly normal conversation, he makes it apparent that he's been touching himself this entire time. Keep in mind nothing suggestive was mentioned, and our conversation at that point was about his new dog. He's blocked once again, but has tried to follow my social media, and now I've started to see him in my area too. Last I knew he lived nearly 30 to 45 minutes in the opposite direction from me. So my question for all of you guys is, am I just reading into this, or should I genuinely consider this stalking, and if so, what should I do? About 6 months ago a group of friends of mine came to my parents' house for my birthday for a few days. This was right after our college had just ended. One night we decided to hang out at the pool in my neighborhood too. I live in a gated community, and there's a community pool in there. It was pretty late at night, around 2:00 or 3 in the morning. Now, over the course of time that we were there, I began to notice shadows moving around in my peripheral vision, and at times the sound of footsteps running behind me. I live in Florida, so I assumed it was just iguanas, or some other sort of wildlife that might be around. However, within an hour or so I continued seeing shadows and hearing strange noises all around me. They would be gone just as quick as I would notice them. Eventually I mentioned it to one of my friends with me that I was seeing and hearing things, and thought I was going crazy. He said, "Dude, you aren't crazy, because I've been seeing and hearing the same stuff too." I just didn't want to say anything. I asked the rest of my friends and some of them didn't notice anything, but others had sworn that they saw shadows moving in the distance. All of us described the same sort of eerie feeling, as well, like as if we weren't the only ones there, but we were. It was late at night, and we had been there alone for hours at this point. Then one of my friends spoke up, and he had told me that he talked to my dad earlier, and that my dad had recently found out that our neighborhood was built on an ancient Native American and burial ground. My parents, they had moved to this neighborhood while I'd been in college, so this was news to me also. I'm personally not religious at all, and I don't really believe in paranormal activity or anything. I've never believed in ghosts and certainly never thought I'd seen a spirit or anything. But now I could have sworn that I was seeing things sure enough too. I looked up the history of my neighborhood location, and hundreds of human remains were found in a sacred burial mound on the land. It was discovered in the early 1900s, just thought to be a mound of sand. After remains were discovered, the land was bought by an archaeological enthusiast, who eventually turned the mound into some sort of amusement park where people could walk through a tunnel and view the remains of Native Americans from like 800 years ago. There were even tigers and lions on the land too, with dozens of exotic animals that were attractions in the amusement park. Eventually, though, this park fell out, and in the 80s it was expected to be purchased by the county as a historical preservation or whatever. However, it was brought out by the current owners of my gated community that exists today that there are dozens of condos and houses built all over the land, and the actual mound is still there today, covered with grass and trees. And to this day I still get the same eerie feeling when I pass by that mound in my neighborhood, because I always thought that it was just a man-made hill, or a decoration, or whatever. But it's not, and guess where it sits? Yeah, right next to the pool. At 4:00 a.m. tonight we got back from our walk. We live in Poland pretty much on the Czech border, and usually take a late walk. Around 2:00 a.m. we took our off-road vehicle into a nearby forest that we've been in many times. We parked the car, and walked across a bridge to a spot that we visited in the daytime. I should also mention that there's two separate sides of this forest. We walk deeper into the woods. Surrounding us are mounds which I think are old war trenches, based on the area's history and items that we found there before. The ground is full of dead leaves, so you could hear any movement, especially this night, because the woods were completely silent. All of the grassy plants or shrubs on the ground around us looked like they had been recently crushed, not cut down, and all facing the same direction, which was a little bit weird. It was honestly like a herd of buffalo came from on top of the mounds and just ran down and trampled them. All I assumed deer did this, but as we were walking closer to the mounds to venture upwards, all of a sudden we hear this heavy thud on the ground, like a weight maybe 60 kilos landed approximately 5 m away from us, closer to the mounds. We didn't see anything or hear any other movement, which was strange. So we decide that this is the time to leave. The bridge is about 20 m away. I'm trying to move quickly. My partner is clapping and shouting in case it's a wild boar. When we get to the bridge, we are still on the same side. Before crossing back to the vehicle, we both stop and shine our flashlights at the forest to see if there's something there. We don't see or hear anything, but about 30 seconds later we begin to cross the bridge, still with their flashlights pointed at the forest, but now, in a bush about 3 m away, are two sets of round yellow eyes staring at us. The first set of eyes is maybe, I don't know, like 1 and 2 to 2 m from the ground, and the other set is about 1 m from the ground. Even though we had just shined our flashlights in that exact spot, and was still an earshot of this bush, we didn't hear anything moving there. You can't even take one step there without the leaves going crunch, though, so that was definitely strange. The only thing that we actually heard was the sound of the initial thud. So how did this thing move so quickly towards us without making any noise? We walked the rest of the bridge backwards while shining lights at this bush the whole time. These eyes were watching us as well. We then jumped into the vehicle, and we got the heck out of there. Luckily it didn't follow us, and whatever this was stopped, stared and just stayed behind the bushes on the other side of the bridge. I can't tell if it was after us or if it was making sure that we left its side of the bridge or something. Initially I thought that it was a wild boar, but I've seen them many times in my life, even at night, and these eyes didn't look the same, plus there was the actual size of the thing. Whatever it was huge. I really don't know how else to explain this, and there's just no other large creatures like that in this area. We will go back tomorrow in the daytime to see if there's any animal prints near that bush, but in the meantime, do you guys have any ideas as to what this could be? This incident took place in the summer of 2023. Last year I transferred with my company to take a new position in a major Midwestern city. My spouse was still working and living back in California for the next few months, so I rented a studio apartment for myself in a newly renovated apartment building in a popular downtown neighborhood until we could look for a place together. The apartment was small, but it was nice. It was in a secure building with interior hallways and a nice downstairs lobby. I was one of the first tenants to move into this newly renovated building, and other new residences soon started moving in too. A major advantage of this move was that I'd only be a couple of hours' drive from my hometown and my parents as well. I started my new job and everything was going great. I was enjoying my new neighborhood, and the neighbors in the apartment building generally kept to themselves, like I did. Then a new guy moved in across the hall, and everything changed. David was a single man in his 60s, and was very different from the college students and young professionals who lived in our building. I started noticing his erratic behavior almost immediately. I would come home from work and he would be sitting in his car in a small parking lot, just sort of staring off in the distance. We were having issues that summer, with smoke clouds coming over from the vast Canadian wildfires. They were leaving a light dusting of ash on our cars, similar to pollen. David, though, was convinced that someone was spraying this dust on his car, and was accusing various tenants that he would run into in the parking lot. He would hoard trash in his apartment and leave trash bags in the hallway, causing a foul odor. He would also be yelling to himself in the hallway. I finally had enough and I complained to the leasing office. The manager was quick to dismiss my concerns, saying that she'd been in this apartment and everything was apparently fine. In August, though, my parents' 50th anniversary was coming up and I was excited to go home and spend a weekend with them. A few days before that anniversary, my boss informed me that he would be flying into work on an important project with me that would have us working throughout the weekend. I was really disappointed and I felt like I was letting my parents down, but I managed to get away for a quick overnight trip in the middle of the week to see them and get back before my boss was due to arrive. I drove down and I spent the night with them, and the next morning I checked my email as I was getting ready to head back. There was an email from my apartment manager in regard to the incident the night before. The email was very vague, but it stated that a resident was dead and there would be further details coming later. My heart sank and I immediately went pale. My mind instinctively went to my strange neighbor David. I opened up a local news app for my city and the top story was an active shooter in my apartment building who was killed during a SWAT team standoff the night before. Apparently David approached my next-door neighbor in the hallway with a gun and threatened to shoot him. The neighbor ran into his apartment and called 911. David also called 911 and told the dispatcher that his neighbors were hacking his phone and if the police didn't come, he was going to start shooting people. The police came and tried to talk to David, but he had barricaded himself in his apartment and claimed to be heavily armed. The state police and the SWAT team soon arrived and David began firing a rifle out of his window at anyone that he saw in the parking lot below. All of the neighbors on my floor were trapped in their apartments with no way of escape. They had to get down and barricade themselves from the gunfire. There was another building across the street, with a direct line of sight into our apartment building. A police sniper took position in the building across the street and shot David through his window. When they flew a drone into his open window, and confirmed that he was dead with a gun still in his hand. They went in. Luckily, nobody else was injured. I got home later that day to a bullet-riddled apartment building, and several neighbors, who normally didn't speak to each other, were hugging and crying and showing each other videos of the incident from their hiding places. I've never been so lucky to have been out of town. If my boss hadn't have messed up my plans, I would have been home that night, and who knows what would have happened. I'm sorry David didn't get the mental health attention that he needed, honestly, but he put so many lives in danger, and I'm just really glad that I wasn't there. This event happened to me and a friend from out of town that I had invited to go hunting one afternoon. This location was in South Louisiana, in an area thick with woods and a lot of palmetto, up to 6 foot in height in some places, and the water that we had to walk into to get to. My deer stands were at least up to our waist at times, so it was slow moving in the mile that we had to walk to our deer stands, and my friend wasn't used to this tough terrain, but he kept up, and when I got to the first stand, which was about 15 feet off of the ground with AL to climb up once he was up, I told him that I would be by to pick him up in about half an hour after dark, since I was about a half-mile past him. It was a full moon that was reflecting off of the water, allowing us to hunt a few minutes longer, and when it became too dark to see, I climbed down from my deer stand with my rifle on my shoulder, and I started walking slowly towards my friend to pick him up. And when I was almost to his stand, I shine my light up, and he just wasn't in the stand, so I shine my light on the ground at the bottom of the stand, and there he was leaning back against the tree that the stand was on, and what was odd was that he wouldn't look my way, even after me calling his name. So I walked up to him within a couple of feet and asked if he was ready to go, and that's when he finally turned his head and looked towards me, and what I saw in his face scared me so bad that I took my rifle off of my shoulder, putting it between me and him. His eyes were rolled back in his head and his mouth was wide open, just standing there looking at me, not saying a word, and he wasn't answering me either. I was asking him what the heck he was doing and what was wrong, but he wouldn't answer me. So there I was a mile or so back in the woods, with solid pelters all around us and up to my waist in water, with my good friend looking at me as if he was possessed or something. And yes, at this point I was scared. So eventually I finally slapped him in the face, and he seemed to snap back to himself. I then asked if he was okay, and his only words to me were, "Let's get out of here now." So with me not knowing what the heck was going on, I made him walk in front of me, the whole way back to the truck, and we get on in, and we left without saying a word. Eventually, I asked him what happened in the woods. Why did he look so shocked or possessed like that? He started crying, and then he started telling me about how apparently he was sitting there in the stand when he heard something coming through the water moving palmetto, as if it was walking, and when it got close enough to see what it was. He said that it was a man that apparently looked like he had been skinned alive, like he had no skin at all on him, and he said that he was so scared that after this thing had passed him, he climbed down and hid under the stand against the tree so that it wouldn't see him if it came back. He was in shock, and when I got to him, that's why he had looked like he did. Apparently he was so shook up and crying that eventually I had to tell him to pull over so that I could drive well. A week went by and I was talking to my little cousin, who had gone out on tour at a near Indian memorial, and they were explaining how this Indian tribe would skin men of their tribe alive and turn them loose in the woods, when they had committed a serious crime in the tribe. And my friend, who had witnessed the skin men a week earlier, wasn't from around this area, and had no way of knowing this. So what did he see that put him in shock like that? Was it a ghost of one of these Indians, who was skinned alive years ago? I don't know, but I just know that the shape my friend was in when I got to him that night in the woods is something that I will never forget. I've been asked many times now in responses and conversations all over the place, to share my experiences, as an Order of St. John chaplain and demonologist. It's hard to know where to start, to be honest, but the most important thing that I think is to say that these are my beliefs and experiences. I certainly don't begrudge you yours and definitely don't want to assert any kind of authority over the beliefs of others. As chaplain, we are not positioned within a church because we minister to communities. It really isn't our place to judge any member of that community, but only to care for and support them in their needs. Also, rule number 1 of the job is to disprove and disprove again. Other than that, to save you the trouble, I'll share things in order of how much interest that I think that they get. I'll begin with experiences, then some insight into our processes, what I'm allowed to speak to anyway, how I got into the field, and then the training that I undertook. So my experiences are this general and passive paranormal experiences are part and parcel of the job. I'll touch on it more later, but I'm not afraid of things that go bump in the night. I used to be. But once you've studied and understand it, the paranormal loses its excitement and becomes more of a puzzle that needs to be solved. My passive experiences are things like every month or so I'll have some new knocking on our doors and windows. Even though we live in a secure third-floor apartment, I get random prods and pokes when I'm by myself, whispering, murmuring, growling, scratching, electrical interference, random distorted shadows and shadow figures here and there. This has all become weekly occurrence, although when I say that it's usually just one of these things that happens, I deal with it, and it goes away almost immediately. But this is probably my most fascinating one, because it's a reoccurring event that happens every couple of months, and I haven't yet solved the puzzle. You see, I travel a lot for my role, and at the moment I've been sent to one of our small towns to train people, run mental health programs, or help with large-scale crisis response sponsors. This results in my driving for long hours, sometimes during the day and sometimes at night, and I will see the same stocky hitchhiking figure walking along the side of the road in a black hoodie and jeans with hood up, thumb out. I've never stopped, mind you, and he's never turned around when I've approached. I've seen him at every point in the day, dawn, day, dusk, night. I mean, I've seen him in location several hours drive from each location as well. At first I honestly thought that it was just a coincidence. But hitchhiking is really uncommon in our country, but we're small and buses are really cheap. So to see this guy like that in so many different locations, something is definitely up the next one. This is another reoccurring one, although it's newer. It's more annoying than anything else, to be honest, but several times my partner and I have been worked to a long hell in our bedroom. Our windows are closed apartment unit, like I said, but it's ruining my sleep and I really enjoy my sleep, so this one is annoying the next one. I'm actually thankful that it's resolved, but I had to deal with it over a series of years to cut a long story short. Whenever I was in the middle of a really tough case supporting someone in what we call spiritual warfare, I'd get a visit from whatever this was. It was the same every time, where I would have a dream of a cloaked figure wake up to a spinning room, and I would be choking. I've had sleep paralysis episodes before, but this was definitely different. I'm still half convinced that this was some kind of sleep apnea issue or episode. The only thing that makes me think that it was paranormal is because it happened without fail when I dreamt of this figure, and it stopped after I put some intentional work into stopping it. There are also some experiences of clients that unfortunately I cannot share, because as I've made a strict confidentiality agreement with them, and that rests on my soul. But generally speaking, I've helped people deal with their psychological issues more than spiritual. Some spiritual ones have been fascinating, and there's a feeling that I get when there's a real obvious sign of oppression or infestation. It's sort of like a heavy feeling on my chest and stuffy air sort of. I've helped people by blessing their houses, which is a complicated process, and depending on your beliefs, can be somewhat risky. You essentially have to call forth the oppressing force, challenge it, rebuke it, and either condemn it or suppress it if it can't be dealt with in one blessing. I've also helped people with deliverance. Although I'm not really big on the evangelical deliverance ministry, we are a more traditional denomination, but I've never helped with an exorcism. I'm still relatively young for my role, and while I am a commissioned member of the order, I'm not yet a fully fledged ordained minister or anything. So now to our processes. We have to be careful with what we share, and that's for a really annoying reason. We often get people who either want to play a prank or desperately want something paranormal to be happening, and the information that we don't share is essentially the key information that we need while triaging our cases. What I can say, though, is how we view the paranormal as unusual. Anything paranormal by ethology is demon, ical, angelic, or the Holy Spirit. When it comes to things that we humans get scared of, well, we are sort of hardwired to be scared of the paranormal, if we believe in. It's a non-interactable nocturnal threat, and it's really easy to trigger our limbic system. However, and again just my view, I see paranormal activity as paired tricks of a damned and jealous entity, but I have the power to send it back where it belongs and it knows that. So it will struggle. However it can. It will try and scare me because it is scared of me, and really it should be because I'm there to do a job. It's sort of like a spiritual pest extermination, I guess, but a moving cup, whispering, growling, etc. is nowhere as scary to me as, say, driving in heavy rain, or the things that I've dealt with as a bouncer while I studied. Humans, dogs, even cats, are more dangerous than most hauntings or paranormal experiences. One exception, though, is that possession is incredibly dangerous, but insanely rare too. I'm not scared of these things, not because I'm tougher or brave or anything, but because they are not really actually that dangerous and they need to be condemned. That being said, if we go through an intensive investigatory sort of process, it looks a bit like this. So we are a medical order. We are also an indigenously focused arm of the order, and our perspective gives us a different worldview. When we assess a person, we don't just look at their spiritual health. We look at their social, physical and psychological health as well. The first thing that we will do fully funded is have the person see a doctor and a psychologist for assessment. This isn't because we think that they are crazy. It's because we are building a comprehensive profile for exactly what we are dealing with. If someone is positive for physical or mental health issues that could be causing symptoms that they believe are spiritual, we need to treat those issues and see if the symptoms go away. Our church fully covers any costs associated with this process too, and if that doesn't solve the problem, my job is to definitively disprove the existence of paranormal activity or presences, but to do so while believing that there may still well be a presence. Skepticism is a good thing most of the time, but it's sometimes bad. I know that we are not there to assume the issue is mundane. We take all the information that we can assess it and arrive at the likely outcomes, and we consider spiritual outcomes to be similar, as likely as mundane ones. However, we still need to disprove all of the mundane theories that we can, but there's another layer to this, you see, because we also need to prove all of the mundane theories too. This helps us have a quality of information, so we won't be happy to say, oh, it's probably just this mundane thing. Unless we can prove that, after this, if there is persistence of a spiritual issue, we begin our church-sanctified process of blessings and protections for the affected individual. These interventions vary on intensity dependent on the person, their faith, relationship, and the persistence of whatever that we are dealing with. I didn't take a standard pathway to this either. A standard pathway is that you attend a church that believes in demonological study. Get as involved as possible with whatever. You can talk to the pastor about your desire to study, and follow this pathway, and see if the church will support you. It's a long pathway, though you can also try to become a sort of lay chaplain for certain denominations, but honestly the best thing that you can do is wholeheartedly commit to a church. Show them that you're willing and they'll support your journey. My pathway was that I studied a youth psych degree and specialized in youth gangs. Then a church was investing into the community and looking for a Christian with my expertise to be their youth pastor. I worked there for some time, and after a bit of a journey came back to my home denomination, and that's who I work for now. I got a master's in professional practice chaplaincy and a diploma in demonology, but my psychology knowledge is what sets me apart for this ministry. In the eyes of the church, I'm much more equipped to do a referral assessment than many of the clergy or congregation. My training in demonology comes from several sources. I completed the diploma at Bible College, but have also done a small amount of training under a course from Bishop James Long. I did the Paranormal Academy of the United Kingdom online course, because it's not Christian, and I trained under our Archbishop for some time to specifically respond to the needs of the community in this regard. As a chaplain, this calling fit under my purview in his eyes, and when I need to escalate church involvement, I go straight to him. He taught me our beliefs, blessings, the process of our church, etc. He also taught me our church's stance on demonology, which is really old school. We are Anglican. King James was a demonologist, so it's a particular field for us, and that's pretty much it. I'm always open to helping people on here, so if you have trouble, please just reach out through a message. I'm also happy to answer questions and engage in a discourse, although I'm not going to be entirely engaging in WHIFS from the stories. For me, it's almost impossible to prove the paranormal online due to the nature of evidence and how easily it can be faked. So I'm not going to get into that, and I've peer-reviewed these things with my colleagues. So to me, I'm satisfied. But before finishing, I would like to offer a couple of more stories. So after I started to get more involved in spiritual guidance and conflict and intervention, we started noticing more stuff happening around the house. One thing that came to visit was a large dark figure. They were about 8 feet tall. I'm 6 feet 4 inches so tall in my own regard, but this thing was huge. It was coming from an underground storage next to our room. We were staying in a basement, after getting involved in a particularly nasty case. Things started with knocking on the door from the underground storage area, but once a day, at random times, we would hear a simple sort of knock 3 times. The area was a brick-walled room with dirt floors, though, but there was no external access by either wind or people. We largely ignored it, and when the knock happened, if I was there, I would rebuke whatever was knocking by letting it know that it wasn't welcome. My partner, however, opened the door after the knocking, but didn't tell me she's not as spiritual as I am, and she was curious to figure out what the knocking was. The next day we were relaxing in bed, when the guitar standing next to the door strummed twice incredibly loudly. Again I rebuked, but again I didn't know that she'd answered the door. That night I was struggling to fall asleep. I was tossing and turning and was frustrated. So opened my eyes to go to my phone, and when I did, roughly 20 feet away, I saw a huge black shadow figure standing in the corner looking at us. It was well built, with broad shoulders and a strong-looking body. I was frozen with shock at first, and then I flashed my phone screen in its direction. It didn't disappear immediately, though, which shocked me, to be honest, but sort of slowly dissipated from the bottom upwards. I prayed an incantation, and I went back to sleep. The next night, though, was the same. I struggled to sleep and had a feeling, and when I was almost asleep I opened my eyes and again there was the figure, except this time it was standing next to the door to the underground area. I grabbed my blessed tire, it's a MRY weapon, and stood, then started to perform a fairly serious prayer. This half woke my partner up. This matters soon too, and as I prayed in the darkness, the same thing happened. The figure slowly disappeared. The next day, my partner asked what I was doing, and I told her. I then asked her if she had seen anything, and she said that she'd been hearing the knocking and tried to find the source. I asked her if she'd opened the door after knocking, and she said yes. So I finally did what I should have, but was probably too scared to at the time in case I picked a fight that I couldn't win. I was new to all of this at the time, and blessed both our room and the storage room. I used frankincense and myrrh incense, holy water and prayers in English, Latin, and my native Mary language. I placed an iron cross above the door on the inside of the house and placed bigger wooden crosses above all of the entry points to my room, including that one, and thankfully I've had no problems since and have gained a heck of a lot more confidence due to a lot more exposure to this day, though I'm not 100% sure what I was dealing with at that point. So, to be honest, I would really like to hear if anybody else has had experiences like this, to try and gain some more information and perspective on perhaps what it could have been. So I shared something about some howling at night and early morning to not too long ago, and also said that I'd been thinking about skinwalkers, and I'd also been reading about them lately. Well, tonight, I was outside with my cousin helping him set up his new basketball hoop. We got finished with it and he was shooting some hoops while I was watching, and it's about dusk at this point. Then he asks me if I want to go inside and I say sure, and then all of a sudden I hear "Help me, please help me, someone help." It sounded like a little girl crying for help near our pond. I was a bit shaken by that, and my cousin had already went inside the door, but was waiting for me. At this point I'm shaking because it's almost like I knew what it was. As soon as I heard it, my cousin came back out and I no longer heard it. Then I'm shaking my way back inside to tell my fiancée, and she looks out the bathroom window, because it's looking out towards the pond, and she sees a little girl out there. Then she tells me to come look. Not even 10 seconds later, and not even 10 seconds later, when I get there's nothing there. What the heck is happening though? First I was knocking and howling, but we are having actual experiences now and I'm seriously starting to worry. Obviously I checked for any sign of an actual little girl, and there was no sign of anyone out there. It wasn't a real little girl, of that I'm sure, and I know that it wasn't. I know who lives around this area, in fact, and I know what happens around here. It's not just some distressed kid. I know that, but I've been reading up on skinwalkers and also thinking about them. I'm about 60 native and also just had a child. Lots of negative things are going on in the family right now. It's pretty chaotic and it's feeding off of these things. I think also, by the time that I got out there, there's no way that she would have fallen in the pond, and there was just no sign of anyone there anyway. There was no splashing in the water, no ripples, and also, when I checked it this morning, there were no footprints or hair, or shoes or clothes or anything either. It was muddy enough to see if someone had been there last night too, and I think I'm going to start to try and catch this stuff on camera to document it, because obviously something weird is going on. So I've told my friends and family this story, and they just look at me like I'm crazy here. I also ended up telling my wife, when we were moving out of the house, that this happened in. I lived in Nevada with my wife in a newly constructed house that was 3 floors. The master bedroom was on the 3rd floor, and there was no door up to the master floor. It was just open, sort of like a loft, but it was a full-sized area, not a converted attic or anything. This is pretty common in Nevada, so that they can squeeze as many thin, taller houses in a lot as possible. But anyway, one night about a month into moving into the house, we are both asleep. I wake up in the middle of the night at around 2 or 4ish and see all the way at the other side of the room, what I can only describe as like a little creature all black, and I couldn't make out any features, or eyes or anything, but whatever it was. It was small, maybe 2 feet tall, I would guess, and had 2 arms and legs like a person, but was sort of wider and didn't move like a person. It was unnaturally fast. It ran quickly to the edge of the bed, and then I could tell that it was looking right at me. I couldn't move, and I very consciously remember thinking, oh no, I do not have time for this. I remember it peered over the mattress and had a longer nose, but for some reason it was not able, or allowed to get on the bed or something. I watched it for about 10 seconds. Then was like, okay, if it can't get up, then I'm just going to roll over. So I rolled over and nothing else happened that night. I know that ending is pretty anticlimactic, but that's what happened to me that night. I never saw anything in that house again except for that one night I was definitely awake and I could move, so it wasn't sleep paralysis. I've had that once and this was much worse and way more terrifying, and I guess I'm just wondering if there's a name for what I saw, or if anybody else has had anything similar happen to them, and what it was. So this happened to me in my early teens. I'm 21 now, and my best friend growing up had this huge farmhouse in the middle of Virginia. It was really old and beautiful, but also had a very dark history. In the house there's a tunnel that leads to an underground room of sorts that was used for slave hide in the 1800s, and I'm 90 sure that some actually died down there while in hiding. So you can imagine the history and the energy that fills this house. I always felt scared there too. I never felt alone and wouldn't go anywhere alone in the house, even just to grab something out of my room, the room that I was staying in. Obviously, even the family was scared to stay there with no company, because of the intense apparitions and also experiences, with which I can get into another day. The rooms, though, were massive and the entire house was white, with honestly a sort of creepy vintage decor. There was even a cabinet of ventriloquist dolls upstairs. No, I'm not joking, they were a really old family, honestly with lots of dark problems, but anyways, the second time that I visited that house, I was with my mom, my best friend at the time, and her mom. It was a girls' trip. One night I woke up and was so thirsty, and the last thing that I wanted to do was go downstairs and get water. I mean, I was terrified. Like everyone else. I hated that house at night, but my mom was pretty much dead asleep, so I literally sprinted downstairs, with my head only looking at the floor. I made my water in 5 seconds, and when I made it to the stairs, something compelled me to look at the giant glass doors that were in front of the stairs. I was horrified, but I don't know. I just felt like I needed to look at the window. What I saw too, when I looked at the window, will haunt me for the rest of my life, because I saw a man as real as anybody else that I'd ever seen before standing there. It was pitch black outside with a huge bright moon. The man was all black like a silhouette, but because of the moon being so bright, I could clearly see his entire body. He was black than black, like he stood out so much that I 100 thought that he was a trespasser. He was wearing a top hat and was unhuman, tall like well over 7 feet. My heart literally felt like it stopped beating, and for a moment I felt like I was in a trance of sorts. I was so unexpectedly horrified, but I couldn't look away. He was also moving a little bit, almost like breathing, I think. Then, about 10 seconds later, he was gone, disappearing into seemingly thin air. Well, I absolutely panicked and bolted upstairs after I snapped out of my trance. That is, I cried to my mom, and was up all night, and I didn't get a wink of sleep after that. The next morning I told my friend and Hiram about the experience, and they were not shocked at all, as they had seen multiple full-body apparitions in the house themselves. They didn't seem to be fussed by it. I found out later too that the nanny that worked for them even refused to go into some rooms of the house after her own experiences. But after that I never went back to that house ever again. This experience happened a while back, but I thought that I might as well share it on here for you guys to hear. So, back in the mid-2000s I lived in this house with my dad, my mom and my sister. Across the road from this house was this massive mansion, which had a lot of residential turnover, which my family, being included, believes is cursed. My sister and I were kind of scared of it, to be honest, because it was this big, dark house that felt uninviting and cold. When my family moved into our house, there was a wealthy businessman living in the mansion across the road who moved in a few months before us. This guy was really rich, like, think, luxury cars, massive dinner parties with his rich friends, etc. Apparently he owned a bunch of businesses. Started a new business shortly after we moved in, and after almost 6 months of starting this business, he went bankrupt. He apparently lost everything. He sold all of his luxury cars, he had no more dinner parties, and he also quickly became an alcoholic. He ended up selling his house because he of course couldn't afford it, but after he sold the house, a young, recently married couple moved in. I have no idea how they afforded the house, but nonetheless they moved in and settled in quickly. My parents actually became quite good friends with them, and we would have them over for dinner occasionally. They stayed in the house for about 2 years, but within that 2 years they had 3 miscarriages. The wife ended up becoming depressed and even had to be committed to a psych ward because she was thinking about deleting herself. These two incidences could be just classified as bad luck. I know that perhaps unfortunate events, but the third one, in my opinion, solidifies that this house is cursed. So another couple moved into the house after the other couple decided to move, and this couple were pretty wealthy. They hired a maid to stay in the house and to assist them with cooking and cleaning, etc. After a year of them living there, we once again got pretty close to this couple, and would sometimes have them for dinner too and swim in the pool that they had as well. One night my dad woke up and had a strange feeling. Apparently he heard something outside, so looked out of his bedroom window, and saw the maid packing her car in the middle of the night. The couple that was living there was apparently away for the weekend, and the maid was staying at the house by herself. He thought that it was weird and was a bit concerned, but didn't think too much of it and went back to sleep. After he went back to sleep, he had a terrible nightmare that the maid ended up ending her own life in the garage of the house. He woke up in the morning a bit shaken from this dream, and had a sort of sixth sense feeling. He decided to go over there and check if everything was okay. He rang the doorbell, but didn't get an answer, so he decided to go around to the back of the house to see if the back door was unlocked. The back door was unlocked, so he went in. He entered the living room, and sure enough, his dream had come true. He instantly ran home and called the police and ambulance, but by the time that they got there, and by that point it was too late. I remember seeing my dad after the event, and he was as white as a ghost. Of course he didn't tell us what had happened, as we were only young. He ended up telling us when I was about maybe 15 or 16 or something, and I don't really bring it up to him, because he hates talking about it and gets really upset about the whole thing. We moved a little bit after the last event happened. I still have no idea what happened to the next family that moved in, but I seriously hope that nothing bad happened to them. To this day, though, I am convinced that mansion is cursed. So myself and 3 of my friends were all sitting in my backyard on my picnic table, the top of it. So we were all facing the same way, looking up at the clear night sky one evening in the small town that we lived in. We had just left the bar and were chatting about our night and smoking a joint, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we saw something really big, all black triangle in shape with no lights whatsoever on it, appear in the night sky. It was a split second that we all saw it move from one end of the sky to the other, and it covered the stars as it did this. It was absolutely massive, easily the size of a football field. All of us just looked at each other and exclaimed at the same time. Did you just see that? It was honestly insane and something that I'll never forget. But then, a few weeks after the incident, I had a very vivid dream that I was on a very cold operating table with what I can only sense as beings that were not human, and they were sort of tickling me each time that they touched me. Almost like a faint electrical current, but there were more than one touching me in different places all at one time. It was weird because I could feel their physical touches while asleep, like I was actually there. I wasn't able to see anything while this was going on. I'm pretty sure that had something over my face, so I couldn't see them or anything around me. However, I didn't feel threatened or scared by them at all, which was a bit strange, because, honestly, I probably should have been. The dream ended abruptly and I woke up in my bed, but it seemed so real to me that to this day I fully believe that maybe I was abducted while asleep so that they could study me. I've not seen the black triangle in the sky since, or had any more abduction dreams, thankfully, but it was definitely one of the strangest occurrences for me to date. I'm wondering, though, if anybody else here has had a similar encounter. When I was a kid, I lived in Clinton, Tennessee. Both parents worked full-time, so I was often sent over to stay with my grandparents, who had a plot of land in the vicinity of, but not right in, Mosheim near Greenville. Both of them had been in East Tennessee for their whole lives and that area for a good many years as well. The video ends here, but the story continues. Subscribe to us and don't miss the next mysterious chapter.